So I've been in the game industry now for about 8 years. Shipped 10 titles. I've worked at EA Sports, I've worked at Activision, worked at Microsoft, and currently I work at a smaller studio. It's actually been an interesting transition for me working at a smaller studio, Darkside Games.
Well, I've experience in a few different fields, but for games specifically, Game Boy Advance, that's one of the first jobs I had when I graduated from Full Sail quite a long time ago. They were launch titles, so it was a really long time ago. From there, I left games after working on a couple titles, and I worked in simulation and worked on a lot of projects from there.
I've been a game producer for 4 years now at all different levels of game production. So I've worked on small web games to full retail release version games.
My experience in the game industry started several years ago. I was a doctoral student and I was consulting in several companies. My interest was in gaming, and this was before gaming became popular as a point of research and discovery. I, since then, have done a lot of consulting work as a project manager and a consultant, you know, in talking about educational gaming, which was kind of my focus. And now I'm moving towards more of the programming aspect and the commercial side.
I worked as a gameplay programmer and engine programmer at various studios, some for THQ, some for Vivendi and Activision.
Well, I've programmed for 15 years, but early on, the first couple of years, I worked at 3DO and at Nspace, and then later did some very game-related software in the simulation, government contracted military simulation industry.
I started in Puerto Rico doing multimedia systems design, which quickly migrated into doing some games for some old school multimedia Shockwave projects. And then as I transitioned from that, I started to do a lot of consulting, multimedia consultant, which involved a lot of programming and a lot of design work. Then it went into freelance game design, which was now more official, working for different local companies and small studios, which basically is where I kind of liked to stay in. So I stayed there, and now I've gone fully into the indie, not freelance anymore, but the indie world's game design space.
I started doing educational games for the University of Central Florida. Worked in a thing called Retro Lab, where we worked on for a variety of clients doing, they're called serious games, educational. And then from there, I came to Full Sail, but on the side I was doing my own mobile game company called Astro Crow, and I still have that, and basically we put out small scale games with just my friends, anyone who is in the industry who has a little bit of talent who wants to work on them.
What drew me into the industry was passion for gaming. I grew up in the time when Atari, don't tell anybody because it's going to make me sound really old, but Atari and television and ColecoVision and all these other things started to come out big when I was growing up, and it was a huge part of my adolescence. So as I got older, I realized that gaming was a huge, powerful force for good if used properly in the educational sphere. And one of my life missions is to try to bring the fun and power of gaming into educational environments.
Very early on, playing video games, Kaboom on the Atari 2600. One of my father's friends would come over, fix that for me, and talk about some of the design elements.
I've always wanted to program video games since I was 6 years old. I actually knew how to program when I was 6 years old. I programmed a very simple game where you guessed at a random number that the computer had picked. I was fortunate that I had an uncle that showed me how to do everything I wanted to do.
I was actually taking a degree on computer animation. It just didn't really work for me. Had a friend who was going to Full Sail, and I have no idea how he convinced me to drop out of my current college and enroll in something I had no idea what I was doing. It just worked out really well.
Really, I've always just had a love of programming. It's kind of an interesting form of problem solving. So once I started to learn it in high school and on my own and into college, I was like, well, what can I do with these tools? What sort of problems can I solve for a living? And you know, you have lots of different options, and you know, business software or simulation, which I didn't really know about at the time, or games. And of course that's very shiny and interesting sounding, so of course that's what I wanted to try and do.
What drew me into the industry was that I've always wanted to do something creative with my job. And as I was a kid, I really loved film and video games. And as video games became more and more narrative, later on in my life, I decided I was going to refocus and focus on doing digitally interactive media. And video games kind of fit that role for me.
I got a couple jobs when I was in college doing business type applications, and I really did not enjoy that. So I liked the fact that I could use that skill to make something that I actually enjoyed. At the end of the day, I could play it and I could show it to somebody.
My biggest success is I've shipped titles on most last generation platforms. So I think I've hit every platform around now, including PC. But my biggest success overall is I took a very at-risk project on my first welcome to the jungle kind of feet in the fire role. And I shipped a project that wasn't going to ship. I managed to get out the door on time and under budget with Activision and Generator X, and I'm super proud of that.
One thing that I think is very important to me is just reaching that goal of getting into the game industry from a very early age, wanting to learn how to do this and being interested in it, and then actually working with some veteran game developers and learning so much about the field. I feel like I accomplished a lot there.
I would have to say it was the work I did with Quest Atlantis, which is a game that was funded by the federal government and private grants and donations. It was a nonprofit organization, and it was a game for kids between the ages of 7 and 14, you know, like the late adolescent high school students. And it really helped a lot of people just getting the word out there. And that was something I did for free, and it was something I really got a lot of enjoyment out of. So Quest Atlantis was, I would say, my biggest success because so many kids were able to use it because of the work that I did. And I'd like to think that it'll change lives I'll never even know about or meet.
On Madden Ultimate Team, I did a lot of the UI work for that, and I think it turned out really pretty. It was a really smooth-looking game, really exciting game mode. So I think that was a fairly recent big success, I think.
My biggest success so far would be my game, The Last Days of Space. And while it's still pretty small scale, it's doing okay as an iPhone game. People respond well to it.
My first big initial surprise, I guess, success was the first title. So you work on your first title, you're usually right out of school, then you go to the game store, and then you see a game that you worked on in the shelves, and you open up the instruction manual, you flip to where your name is. It's very exciting.
I think my biggest success has been able to collaborate with people in very highly creative environments.
You know, as a programmer, it's every little problem that was actually tricky for a while, and is eventually solving it. That was what kept me going through the day. Just seeing your product released also definitely gives the feeling of success. Go see it on the shelves at some store.
The development process I currently use is often called extreme programming or XP programming. The way people used to do it a lot was the waterfall method. Several years ago, I was working at a company and we did the transition to Scrum that a lot of people have done, which is a type of agile development. Inside of Scrum and Agile, you have lots of different kind of facets, but definitely the one that I found that works the best in most situations for gaming is XP, which is also known as pair programming. This is where one programmer sits at the computer and is writing code, and another programmer is sitting with them at the same computer. So it's kind of peculiar. It's not common in a lot of other industries, but they work together, looking at the code, and it's commonly you'll see people saying like they're pointing at the code, and they literally are like pointing at the screen and stuff. And it's kind of interesting. It's a form of collaboration, and since it requires two normally, it's usually a senior and a junior type programmer setup. You can't really do it on large scales. You can't make your whole company do this. You'd have to have even number of people or something, and human compatibilities wouldn't necessarily work out really well. But there are certain times during production when that can work really well for a lot of good problems.
The process I always fall back to is a rapid prototype design process. where you analyze the project, and then you go into a design phase, and then you go into a develop phase, and then you go into an implement phase, and then you would go into an evaluation. And even if you rapidly prototype something that is far from complete, many times you can see where the problems lie, both human performance issues, human resource issues, technological issues, by coming up with a very small version of whatever that final dream project is going to be.
I definitely prefer the agile development as opposed to waterfall, where waterfall just never seemed to actually match what was actually going on, having some task list assigned for years in advance that doesn't really match what actually happens.
We use an agile Scrum process, and the process switches per team that I use because we scale it differently. Different teams work different ways. But I tend to work in an agile iterative environment where we schedule for 2 straight weeks. And then at the end of those 2 weeks, we play our testable game, and then we make refinements for the next sprints off the results of that play test.
My development process as a software engineer is pretty rigid and fixed in all the different methodologies that are out there. So like an agile sprint-like methodology, or even a partial waterfall methodology where there's some design up front and then there's a development and testing phase, and perhaps maybe you revisit those cyclically.
My development process when I make games is generally I will come up with an idea and I'll find an artist that fits that style that I'm thinking of, and then I'll start working out plans with them. And I like to give the artist 100%, with a caveat, 100% creative freedom unless it doesn't work, unless it doesn't gel with coding or the gameplay. And so I'll let him go and make his art, and he'll give it to me, and then I'll just put it into my game, see what I can do with that, and see how it's working. Give him some notes on revisions. A lot of times I don't even have the artist with me. They're in other parts of the country. I even have a sound guy who's in Japan right now, and we just bounce notes back and forth until it's ready.
A lot of it depends on kind of which studio you work at. Usually that's something I let the program manager guide me along. So he'll say, hey, it's time for you to develop a schedule for these tasks, or give me what these certain parts of the game will be. And I kind of just go along with that. I'm much better kind of when I'm given tasks and schedules to do. My experience has been managers or producers will come to me and say, hey, we want these types of things. And then they'll ask me for amounts of time that they think that I can do it in. And then they disregard all of those numbers and put their own numbers in and then give us a new schedule. That's been my experience.
I think free-to-play games are great. I mean, if you think about, let's say, just the Xbox games or the console games as a whole, a lot of these games are really expensive, and there's very few things that burn people of limited income more than dropping $60, $70, $80 plus $500 now on a system and finding out that the games are not enjoyable.
There's 2 different types of free-to-play to realize. There's the American version of free-to-play, where it's not pay-to-win, and then there's the Chinese version of free-to-play, which is pay-to-win. And knowing the distinction across those lines is hugely important in how you design your games, and what defines a good free-to-play game is the audience that it's actually geared towards.
There are situations where it's done really well. For example, Team Fortress 2, great free-to-play game. First-person shooter, it's free now. Initially it did cost, but now it's free. And they generate money by selling hats, essentially. So 0 impact to gameplay, everything is as it should be, but you just get these really silly hats. That's their model. Makes a ton of money for them. But the game is, just a normal game, unimpeded by this pay model. The trend I don't like is what you see in a lot of mobile games, where they say, hey, we want to make a lot of money, we want to prevent the player from doing stuff, how can we aggravate them enough so they give us money? And then they build a game around this model. So that's the part I don't like.
I think free-to-play is a new idea. It's something that it's got future potential. I think we're going to see a lot more games, a lot more studios go with the free-to-play option. I think it's nice to have alternatives, and free-to-play is just one more alternative to consumers.
I think free-to-play is just fine. I think it's a expected evolution of how gaming works now. the monetization models for gaming. It has a lot of sort of like a backlash period that we're in right at this moment, but at the same time, a lot of indie developers are sort of also kind of answering that and saying why they have to go to free-to-play. Certainly in the mobile space, I think free-to-play is the future of how we're going to do games. It'll be interesting to see how that affects PC and console, but I think it's just fine. I think the part that's negative or the people have a problem with free-to-play is there's so many ways you can set up monetization in a game, and a lot of new game companies try to do so many, and it kind of is annoying to the player or bothersome to, certainly to traditional players. But there's a lot of new indie groups that are saying, hey, we're going to do free-to-play, but we're going to try to do it this way, in a less obtrusive way, and not so, in such a, it's perceived as very greedy. But I think there's a balance that's coming, and then I think people will be pretty happy with it. And certainly, if you look at young gamers, and like students that I have, and even my kids, they have grown up with it now. So in fact, I've had a situation in the games that we developed where we didn't do monetization that was free to play. We would get communications from the players that said, "Hey, there's this element in the game that's really difficult. Is there any way that I could ever buy it?" Which is kind of interesting. So they're kind of expecting it from playing other games, but it wasn't supported because we were doing traditional monetization. So over time, the players are going to sort of drive that as well, I think.
Free-to-play is interesting. It's an interesting paradigm. It's certainly changing the industry. Very hot topic right now. I think some of it was necessary. You remember shareware back in the day, and you didn't really want to pay $30, $40, $50 for a product without really knowing something about it. So free-to-play gives you that ability to test the game out, try features, see if you really want to invest further into it. And it's pretty much becoming the standard now.
I don't like the name, as it's rarely actually free. Don't really have a problem with the model in general other than that.
Jim Sterling from The Escapists, he calls it free to wait. Nintendo calls it free to start, which is very interesting. It's like you can start the game for free, but you can't maintain it for free. Free to wait, in Jim Sterling's opinion, is that you are free, obviously, to wait. If you want to continue, if you want to enact or do something, then that actually costs something. It's almost like saying, it's not $10, it's $9.99. It's a psychological trick in many ways.
I have a game that I put out called Zombie Run Dead, and in that it's free at the beginning, and then you play the game and you collect items as a currency. There's two different levels of currency, as a lot of free-to-play games have nowadays. And then you can use those credits to upgrade to unlock more features of the game. I personally, my opinion on that is if it can be integrated into your game well, I'd say do it. Otherwise, if you want to have free-to-play just to have free-to-play, you end up watering down the gameplay. But when I do free-to-play, I prefer to have something where you're already getting the content that was designed, and then the additional content is just that, it's additional. It's not something that you can't experience the essence of the game without it.
I write our in-house game engine for Full Sail, so I like that one.
And I think a lot of engines are very similar in terms of their feature set. They're also kind of a double-edged sword. They do a lot for you in some respects, but then you have to kind of shoehorn other parts of your software around it, which can cause performance issues.
I think that Unity balances very well the content pipeline to script in a way that it doesn't do things for you. It lets you figure it out. It lets you, yes, spend a little bit more time that perhaps you would have wanted, but certainly it's like a sandbox, and it works.
I was using Cocos 2D, and it's not perfect for sure, Cocos 2D, but the reason I got into it is when I started doing AstroCrow mobile gaming was about 3.5 years ago. that was really the best one that was out there. And it was such like a new market. Cocos 2D I think was like a version 0.8 or something like that. Now it's at 3.0. It got bought up by Zynga. But Unity, the obvious best part about it is the fact that I can deploy to all different platforms. Like before, all my games were iPhone, and I was always telling myself, eventually I'm going to do it on Android, but I'm going to have to recode everything from scratch, and then I'm going to have 2 separate versions, and it's going to be annoying. So now with Unity, I just make it once, and I can deploy to Android and iPhone just by, it's as simple as literally saying, I want iPhone, and then I want Android, and it just pops out the desired platform.
And from a production standpoint, it's really more what the engineers want to use, what the designers are comfortable using to make the best game possible. And that's kind of their tool. And I work as a producer, I will work around whatever is best to help them make the best game.
So my preferred engine, I'd have to say, is Unreal. I've done more work and I've shipped more games in Unreal than I have any other engine.
My preferred engine, usually one I write my own. I like to write native code, so I just like to look at the application, look at the needs of the game I'm going to write, and then gear something towards that's going to suit it really well.
Each platform poses a unique set of challenges, and I love tackling those. So I don't like to go back over platforms. Sometimes I like to try new platforms out as often as I can. But personally, for gameplay, I play a lot on consoles. So I played a lot on the Xbox 360 and the PS3, and I'm anticipating I'm going to play a lot on the Xbox One and the PS4.
As a gamer, my preferred platform is Xbox One, because I've always been a Microsoft fanboy. Since the first Xbox came out, I've been Microsoft all the way. And so that kind of bleeds over into development. If I enjoy playing on the console, of course, I'm going to enjoy developing for it.
I started out doing iOS development right when it launched in the mobile space. And it was really fun. It was really cool. It was, you could do stuff you couldn't do anywhere else, which was pretty neat. But and it was like the only game in town for a long time. But Android has really expanded and sort of picked up the charge and can give iOS a run for its money on its capabilities for systems. And the distribution model on Android is so good for indies that sort of alone makes me like it.
If I had to choose a platform to develop for, it would probably be iOS, but I'll say that there's pros and cons to iOS and Android. Those are the ones that I would prefer. So with iOS, you have more consumers. From reviews that I've read, they generally say that there's more people who would actually buy games that aren't just free games on iOS. But then with Android, the thing that I like about it is you can just update whenever. For instance, last night I put one of my games, Zombie Beatdown, on Android. I literally just clicked yes, submit it, and it was up on the store instantaneously. With iPhone, every time you submit something, it takes about 1 week to maybe even a month for it to get approved. And then the thing that's terrible is if they reject it, then you find out one week to a month later, and then you have to fix that and then resubmit it again. So it becomes really, really tiring. Same with updates. With Android, you just instantly do an update. One of the cons of Android is I hear it's a lot easier to pirate games. And from what I've seen, you can just install a project file. So anyone can just trade that. So you have a lot higher risk of people just pirating and not giving you a sale.
I did some projects with Facebook, and Facebook is the thing. But I think that, I would love to see games put on things like Instagram, because I think that that's where we're going. But I see a bear market with things like, what's the next big thing that people are using? So social media is, you can become rich overnight in social media if you're smart.
I prefer developing for Windows. I don't like iOS because it uses Objective-C, which it's just a terrible programming language.
So for me, a lot of the stuff I do is all UI based. So you almost have to localize your code for each system you work on. If you're shipping a game on the Wii, the Xbox, and PlayStation, you might have a screen that says press X to continue. Except on Xbox, it says press A to continue. And then on Wii, you can't use control. You can't say push A on the controller. They say you've got to use Wiimote instead of the word controller. So then you've got to substitute that out. And then they could potentially use a gamepad on the Wii U. So you almost have to localize your code for each different platform.
To be really brutally honest, the biggest challenge with cross-platform development is money, in the sense that if you have a good resource base, you're going to get people who can do both. And if you have programmers who can't do both, you don't want to hire them.
I think the biggest challenge for cross-platform development is communicating the technical requirements changes between the platforms. Each platform has its own inherent set of way you develop for it. And to be able to take a concept in a game and make sure that it works across both a console environment, sometimes a handheld environment, or even being able to take a game and to make a version that works with a mobile environment off that same concept and making sure it's versatile enough to go, it's all about communication.
We are in the game industry, so I think the question should be, have you ever had a project actually be on schedule? Everything runs over. What I always find is, it's like the 80-20 rule, I think it's called, where the 80% of the game takes 20% of your time to do, and then the last 20%, which is the polish, which is the things that everyone judges you the most harshly on, and it's really a determining factor if they're going to buy your game or tell their friend or not, takes the remaining 80% to work on.
Yeah, I've certainly had lots of projects go off of schedule. I think, every project ever really has gone off schedule. One of the big reasons for this I found is just it's really hard to think about how long it's going to do something with engineering, with programming. If you say how long will it take you to fold the laundry, well, that's easy. You've done that before, or it's kind of a discrete activity. But with programming, with engineering, there's always something that comes up, and it's very hard to kind of calculate that. So most of the projects I've worked on that have gone severely off schedule, it was just from bad time estimations, or an engineer giving a time estimate and then it being ignored. Usually, when you give it to your program manager producer, they like to shrink it down some, so you have to go way higher, and then they shrink it some, and then you try to get it to where you actually think it's going to be.
A lot of times projects go off schedule because of communication and bad management, in the sense that the managers aren't keeping close enough track and don't know what's going on. Or it could be a sense of, let's say, the programmers and developers not being honest with others or themselves. So a lot of times it's a breakdown of communication, because if communication flows well, they can find where the problems are and fix them.
A lot of people did the waterfall model, which involves various stages of design and then implementation, sort of segmented. And it's notorious for slipping schedule. Agile programming and Scrum came in to sort of help fix this problem, or it was at least one tactic to solving it. But before I did Agile, certainly projects went off. Agile really helped prevent that. And when you get off schedule with Agile, you can get back on really easy. So in terms of getting back on, it's not a difficult thing, or shouldn't be, or there's something really went wrong. If you don't do some sort of Agile programming, and you just do straight on design and development, the waterfall model, or even modifications of that, what happens, and the game industry still does this enormously, is you get behind, you reach some threshold of behind, and you enter a crunch, and now you crunch forever. And that's like the famous thing about game design for sure.
How do we get back on track? We have to cut things we didn't want to cut. What are the things that you can sacrifice? And sometimes time is what you have to sacrifice.
There's a number of things you can do to get back on schedule. Crunching is the worst, but sometimes it's inevitable. Sometimes you just have to replan, figure out really where your problems are, and reprioritize how you want to handle your things. Sometimes you find that if you are off schedule, you're working on work that you shouldn't be working on, and then you go back to your plan, you go back to what you laid out in the Scrum, what you'd commit to in the Scrum, and realize, oh, okay, this isn't needed, so we'll work on that later, we'll put that back in the backlog, and keep going with what we are supposed to be working on.
The company that I worked at for a long time, we did 1 week sprints, which is kind of a short sprint, but the 1 week sprints really guaranteed that we would never, if you slipped off schedule, it was a very little amount. In fact, one thing that kind of does in terms of crunch is, let's say you had a 1 week sprint and you slipped on that sprint, which meant within 7 days you sort of addressed this. Then you might go into a crunch to fix that within the next week, and you should be back on track in theory. That's what should happen. But that's also where weekends crunches came in. So we have a sprint meeting on Monday, and on Friday you have your review, and that's when you would know if you've slipped. Like before the end of the week, you'd know you'd slipped. And if everyone was really pulling together, then the people involved in the slippage may work through the weekend, and by the Monday you're back on schedule. So you don't have sort of a cascading failure of scheduling.
How do you get back on schedule when you're off schedule on a project? Depends on how badly you are off schedule. If it's something really, truly critical and terrible, sometimes you have to fire people because someone along the way, and you have to know, people have to know that everyone's replaceable. I mean, not to be cruel, but that's just the way the world is. If it's something minor, it's finding out who was responsible, truly responsible, and finding out why, what happened, where was the disconnect, and fixing it. Do they need more time? Do they need more help? Do they need more resources? Because most people want to be successful. Most people want to succeed. It's not a matter of motivation, because for most people, it's, especially in this field, because a lot of people are very good and can get a lot of jobs, it's a question of what didn't they have to do what it was they needed to do.
I think the majority of the failures, there is always issues with people. People have different personalities. People clash. In that project, what was happening was that there was an API or something that needed to be included in order for it to be distributed. The project worked without problems. The program worked without a hitch. But that, in order to meet certain compliance, the package had to include an installer, a separate installer, just in case a person needed it. And I tested it and I checked it and everything was fine. But I was responsible for it. When the printers got back, we tested one of the demos and we tested it in a machine that didn't have that thing installed. It wasn't included in there. And the whole thing had to be sent back and reprinted and then reshipped. And it was very embarrassing for everybody.
When I first started to implement an agile process, I didn't understand the necessity of buy-in. So what I would do is I would schedule out the Scrum for them and tell them what their tasks were going to be without initiating the original communication. And I wasn't getting the buy-in necessary to make Scrum work. So I was skipping the most important step of Scrum, which is you're supposed to have your team together and your team buy-in. And what was happening was it felt more like I would offer tasks, they would try to do them even if they didn't make sense, because I was blocking off that two-way communication. It was only one way at that point, and I couldn't understand why I wasn't getting communication back. It's because I was skipping that first step, and it was a major epic fail on my part. It took me a month to correct.
When you're a junior programmer, you come into work and your lead will say, today I need you to do this task. And then you'll do that task, and then at the end of the day you can leave with peace of mind knowing that you got your work done for the day. A lead has to have a little bit more accountability for that. A lead can't just say, I did my job, so that's that. And one problem I ran into at one point, I was told to integrate a number of changes into the game that a bunch of other programmers had made, and I was told that those changes were all ready to go, just waiting for me to integrate them into the game. And I planned on working on it as if they were all ready to go, but in fact, when I tried to integrate them, I found out that these changes didn't do what they were supposed to do. That ended up me coming in on the Saturday and doing all the work that these guys should have done, and then integrating it myself, and that really sucked. And because I came in on Saturday, I got into trouble for working on Saturday.
Poor project management can lead to a whole host of problems, one of which I've seen is developers being burnt out, people leaving the projects shortly after or in the the last minutes of the project, last few weeks or few months, just sapping all the developers' energy out. If it's not managed properly and that schedule is kind of adhered to, or at least people know what's coming, and quality of life is considered, then I've seen a lot of people get burned out in the software industry, and I still think that's a problem. I think managing in general is challenging, but I think managing software is even more challenging because a lot of people who are not software engineers really don't understand the process. We as software development engineers hardly understand the process sometimes, it's so complex. So very often I've heard managers or other designers, non-programmers say, hey, you can do this, right, in this amount of time, and it's really hard to put a set amount of hours or number of days or weeks on a particular feature.
And the thing about coding is it's a very refined art. It's like a black magic, meaning a lot of people don't understand what it is or even how it works. And the biggest problem is they don't understand how much time it takes and speculation. It's very hard for somebody to, before I've even put a line of code into the computers, for someone to say, how long do you think this will take you to do? And that's like the kiss of death, is when you have a client or a manager who wants you to give them an estimate and then you have to stick by that. And you can be running into things that, like, a lot of times the easiest things you don't even realize will take the longest to do. And it's the ones that aren't even visible to the users. For instance, I was working with an unnamed artist who actually worked for Marvel. He does comic covers for Marvel. And I was going to help him work on a game for him. He gave me all the art assets. I rigged up an entire character in 2D, which is very hard to do from scratch. Took a lot of time, build a menu system, build a navigation system, all these core components of the game. And when I showed it to him, the only feedback he said was the text on the bubble, on the buttons, was a little bit crooked. So obviously you lack the level of detail that we're looking for. If he knew anything about coding, that's literally, I change one number, I say, oh, it's in position 5, make it position 7, and it's fixed. And he could not tell the other things. And because he was actually the person in charge of evaluating my progress, I actually got kicked off of that project. And I was fine, because I realized that's not someone I'm going to want to work for, because that's going to be, that's just the start of my headache. I've had other situations where internally, people above me who once again were not coders had heard terms and were using terms incorrectly, such as an alpha build. They wanted an alpha, which generally means you have the game is play throughable. There's a bit of bugs, there's a bit of missing assets, but you see the general scope of the game. His definition for the alpha was 99% complete game with final art in it, no bugs. And I found this out 2 weeks before my deadline. And that was very, very frustrating to me. Needless to say, at that office now, they have on the whiteboard in big letters, an alpha build is, with their own definition.
I feel one project I worked on definitely had some failures from management. We were definitely behind on our schedule for quite a bit of time, and whenever I asked my manager about it, if we were going to try to catch up or anything, I would often be told that we just finished the last project, and everybody was on really hard schedules for that, so we're taking it easy now. That was the answer for about 9 months until I quit.
I think that you go through game development, the whole process is solving problems on your feet. That's really what game development is. When we plan, we have a very high level of what we're going to do. You might, on UI, you might think that you're going to do this screen or this particular menu in this week, and then you start putting together the things for this menu, everything that you need to display to the player, and you realize, like, if it's the online menu, for example, that all you know about the player is their IP address, and you can't just show that to the player. And the person that wrote the online system is the person that probably should have made this accessible to you, but they're already pushed to the maximum already. They've moved on to their next task, And so you kind of have to figure out a way to get all the other information that you need to show to the player. So maybe you have to write a little bit of online code, or maybe you have to write a little bit of AI code if it's some AI feature that you're trying to display to the player that you don't have all the variables you need for that. Sometimes you have to go into other areas of the code base or write more UI code than you thought you would have to, and you really don't know until you hit that point when you're ready to show everything to the player that it's not all there for you to show.
I was just submitting the game, and there was just an error for some reason. I went to package my game up for submission, and it just kept giving me an error. It would run fine. I couldn't figure out what the reason was, and I just started removing things in my code, which is what one good way is like a divide and conquer method. Just pulling out code, seeing if the error still pops up, keep doing it, until something happens. And it turned out that they have a limit in your final package for the iPhone where you have to have what's called commenting out code. You can only have so much space that is comments, which doesn't make any sense as you're coding, because that's all stuff that's not being read by the compiler. Yet for some reason when it packages it, I guess it keeps the comments inside. So I actually had to just remove comments, things that don't change the code whatsoever when you play the game or when you interact with it. I just had to keep removing those until I was under the limit, and then I could submit it.
A lot of times the core of that is listening. So many people just want to jump in and give you their opinion. But to me, great leaders are not just people who are managers. Great leaders are people on all levels of the development. I mean, a teacher is not, the principal doesn't come in and teach, per se. The president of the company doesn't come in and help you program. You have to look at yourself as a boss. You have to look at yourself as a leader. So everybody always has to think on their feet, and a lot of that comes with listening.
We were going through Final Project, and we were making a physics-based platformer, and their students were trying to do it on their own because we were very short on time, and we wanted to add physics into the game. It was going to make it a better game. And I remember that we argued for the fact to use an API because one of our students said, hey, I can do this. I can figure it out and I can do it. And I'll never forget that conversation we had with the teachers, and he's like, I'll put in the extra time to get it done. And he got it done. He worked with the guys from the program. He was able to get in contact with them. They were giving him a lot of extra help, and he went the extra mile and solved that issue.
We were processing lots of different types of files in the e-discovery industry. We were using a library that would compute a bunch of information about particular files, tell us what file type it is, and all kinds of information, including hashes, MD5 or 512 hashes. I noticed that it was pretty slow when we were doing some of the profiling. So I actually stayed all weekend, and I just, by doing some testing in my shell, I noticed that the standard GNU Unix version of some of these hashing routines was much faster. And it's free, open software. So I just got that, put it together in C, built a little DLL, stayed all weekend and got that all working. And by Monday morning when people came in, our hashing time was like 90% faster, and our overall file processing speed was like 10% faster. So that felt really good, and that was kind of spontaneous.
I think a lot of people would say that the most gratifying part of doing a game project, is when you have the final game, you have some sort of playable. And that's certainly true if you're working for a long period of time and you don't really have a playable. Doing the development process ends up being the most gratifying part of it, because you're constantly solving problems, creating new stuff, eventually maybe finding mistakes or sort of technical dead ends, but within some short scope. So you've explored that space, but then now you're satisfied that it's not worth doing some particular side piece, backing out without having really big costs, and then getting back to playing the game. So you tend to play test it while you're making it. In fact, when I get to the point where the game is shippable, I have almost no interest in it. Now, that's probably true for a lot of big projects because people don't want to have anything to do with the project anymore. They're kind of burnt out on it. But it's different because when I'm ready to ship, I know the game so well, forward and backwards, inside and out, that there's nothing for me to do there really, other than to let other people try to explore it. Like, the space is entirely explored. So the most gratifying part is the production, which is a good place to be, because that means as soon as you stop, you just want to start again on the next project.
So what's most gratifying to me about software development projects in the game industry is when things come together, maybe on a particular milestone or when you're shipping, of course. Everybody's really excited about that. But it can also, in the very early stages, it can be very exciting as well, because it's a huge unknown. I mean, you do have a design, you do have some schedule, but you're writing some of the core systems for the first time, you're producing some very early prototypes for some of the other departments, and there's a lot of energy. What seems to be the worst is you have this like inverse bell curve, kind of in the middle, at some of the grueling, crunching times, or when you're not seeing a lot of the results, and you're doing a lot of bug fixing, or there's just so much to write at that time, and you've been doing it for months or even years at that point. That can be very challenging. But when things do come together on the milestones and the ship dates, I think it's something special.
The most gratifying part of the development process for me is solving the tricky bug of the moment. So as a programmer, there's always something that's churning in my head that I haven't quite solved yet. And when you get those, you finally figure out the elegant solution to these seemingly tricky problems. They're usually very simple, but it gives that warm, fuzzy feeling.
The most gratifying part of the job in any creation, game design or musicianship or anything, for me, is collaboration. I call it the holy grail of any creation. If you find a person that knows what you're thinking, how you're thinking, and that you can just drop all the social platitudes and etc., and you can just talk about the work. When that happens, there's nothing better than that.
The most gratifying part of at least the indie development process, speaking from experience, is I can build whatever I want. I can do what I want. I don't have to follow anybody's codes. I don't have to have revisions unless I deem them necessary. And I really like that freedom with indie.
The most gratifying part of the development process is definitely writing 1,000 lines of code and then hitting build and seeing no compile errors. Doesn't happen too often, but sometimes you budget this time for debugging your code and fixing problems that you've introduced. And then when you don't have to do that, when you spend an hour, 2 hours working on something and then you finally get ready to build it and you do, and it just all works and everything's perfect, like, wow, that doesn't happen every day. Look how good that looks, and that took no effort.
Initially, you're kind of planning, writing tools, just getting things ready. That part I don't really like. But once you take that initial bit and then begin to apply it, and you start to see the dream of what might become the product, that part for me is extremely gratifying. When I can start to see, when I can start to imagine what's the end result's going to be. I really love that part.
I think the most gratifying part of the development process for me is seeing the game ship. I mean, there's nothing like having a plan that you've executed on and a product that you're proud of in the end.